everyone is getting poorer. Everything is getting worse. All the people that are doing real work, they are getting screwed.
Jimmy, thanks so much for your time. We're here with Jimmy Song. He doesn't need an introduction in the Bitcoin space, but I picked up his recent book, Fiat Ruins Everything. And I'll go ahead and say that like we talked about, there it is. I got a copy too. So I'll go ahead and say that if you're looking for a shortcut and basically a way to circumvent a lot of the normal pitfalls that people take in the Bitcoin journey, I'd pick up this book. I think basically learning about the system that we're in and how fiat really influences the world we live in, from a high level to even down to politics and interpersonal relationships. It's really interesting, and you lay it out great. Jimmy's a great writer, and he basically, it seems more conversational when you read it, and every page you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, or maybe that's where that's why I'm seeing this in my life. So, Jimmy, thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be on.
I think we'll just get right into the book. We need to define some terms, if that's all right. I want just a little taste of each topic, so people pick up the book and sort of get down the rabbit hole themselves. But we'll start with the definition of fiat. What system are we in, and what needs to change about it?
Yeah, so fiat comes from Latin. It's "let there be." That's basically what it means in Latin. And there's this idea in law that you can create things by fiat by saying so. And it's kind of a weird concept, but a lot of judgments in courts and stuff like that are done by fiat. A judge may say, "Hey, like, you need to build this facility here to make it equitable," or something like that. That's judicial fiat. What fiat money is it's money created out of that same idea. It's just by saying so, and that's what we mean by fiat here. And it's become sort of a term to describe a lot of the institutions and organizations that come out of this money that gets printed from nothing, which is essentially the world that we live under everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it's unfortunate, but that's how it works. And yeah, I can get more into it, but that's the definition of fiat.
No, that's a great start. I'm going to keep going with some definitions. So basically you have fiat, and based on the system we're in, there are certain incentives which lead to, you talk about it throughout the book, the idea of rent seeking. Could you go
Mhm.
through rent seeking and what that means in the fiat system?
Yeah, so rent seeking is this idea that you stay in the middle of some transaction, right? So somebody wants to trade, A wants to trade with B, and you sort of like get in the middle of it and tax the transaction in some way without providing any value. So the typical example would be a government bureaucrat whom you have to get some permission from to complete some transaction that you want to do with this other person. They don't actually add any value. You just have to get their stamp, and you not only cost you in money in terms of the fees for their approval, but also for in terms of time and effort and things like that. So that's what I would define as rent seeking.
Gotcha. Okay, so maybe one more, and then we'll get to some of the ideas. You have the system by decree,
Hmm.
and the rent seeking is basically the middleman from the consumer or the product, and I assume the money printer. And so, why is the money printer such a big player in the society? And then it leads to something called the Cantillon effect that you talk about.
Hmm.
Could you just
Hmm.
expand on those ideas and where those come from?
Yeah, so let me define Cantillon effect for you. So, when you have fiat money, you have somebody that is able to create the money out of thin air. And in a central bank backed fiat monetary system that we're in, that is basically anybody in the banking industry. So this includes, your mom and pop retail bank, the one that you go to, Bank of America around the corner, maybe Wells Fargo, something like that. Also, commercial banks, which are a significant part of the economy. like State Street or something like that. Investment banks, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, players like that. And of course, the central bank of the United States, and that is the Federal Reserve. And in other countries, it's the Bank of Japan, Bank of China, European Central Bank, Bank of England. Those are all different central banks of the currency that they're using. Um, but those are the central banks, and they create the most money, and it's created through loans, and we can get into that in a little bit. But essentially, what the Cantillon effect is that the first spenders of the money, the people that have access to the newly created money, get benefits at the expense of the people that get it at the very end. So
Mhm.
if you are a government contractor or if you are an investment banker, you have access to newly printed capital, and you can spend that into the economy before everybody else. So you get value for that newly printed money at the rate uh, before the expansion. So by the time it goes through the economy, the very last spenders kind of get screwed at the expense of the first people
Mhm.
that get to spend the money, and they generally tend to be fabulously wealthy and many other things.
Right. Right. And so that's a great transition to I'm gonna go through three of the main topics that I pulled from the book. There's so many more, but
Mhm.
we'll start super high up on a national level. You have the money printer under each fiat system. So on a national level, you have said a few times in interviews and stuff that the M2 money supply in the US in 1959 was 289 billion. Tell me if I get this right.
Mhm.
And then in fast forward to 2023, we're up to 21 trillion.
Mhm.
So overall, that's a 7% debasement. I think most people don't really see that or feel that, and people
Mhm.
just go through their lives. And so that's why this topic was so interesting to me. It's where is this coming from? Why
Mhm.
inflation in the first place? So on a
Mhm.
national level, could you talk about some of the interests that are in play and why that debasement's necessary?
Yeah, so the 7% a year is the rate of monetary expansion. And this is the classical definition of inflation. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about monetary expansion. So what does that do, and where does it come from? Well, it comes from a lot of different sources, but the obvious one at the national level is to fund a budget deficit. So in the United States, we've run a budget deficit pretty much every year since I think Andrew Jackson back in like 1830 or something like that.
Mhm.
So every year you have this deficit. You get so much money in tax revenue, and you are spending more than that revenue. So where does that gap come from? And this is where money printed from nothing comes into play. So currently in the United States, I think the deficit is about 1.5 trillion a year. So say they take in 5 trillion in tax revenues, and they are at the same time spending 6.5 trillion on all kinds of stuff, including military and IRS, Medicare, and all kinds of other stuff. So that's the budget. Where does that 1.5 trillion come from? Well, technically, it's the Treasury um, selling bonds into the market, and those are not surprisingly called treasuries, and these are supposedly the most safe investment vehicles in the world. But oftentimes there's not a market for all of the treasuries that they need to sell. In the case of this fiscal year, that would be about $1.5 trillion of bonds that need to be sold into the market. So when there aren't enough people buying, say they buy like 200 billion worth, which would be a tremendous number, but let's just say that the other 1.3 trillion needs to be bought by somebody. And in general, in the United States, that is the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. And they are called the lender of last resort for that reason. So it's not exactly them that buy it. Usually it's like the commercial banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System that will buy it and then put it on their balance sheet. But that's essentially what it becomes, is that they print money so that the government can deficit spend. And that's a major reason why this 7% occurs, because you have a lot of monetary expansion happening at all levels.
I don't know if you've seen, I recently saw sort of an interview that Tucker Carlson put out on
Mhm.
Twitter, and whatever you think of him, it's pretty objective. He goes to Argentina. I don't know if have you seen this, the Argentinian,
Mhm.
the little series he did, and some of the folks that he interviews, it's almost like, would it be? I want to get your take on if this is just the same system we're in fast forwarded, because he goes to Argentina, and after interviewing some folks, there's some figures like there's 46 million people in the country, and he said,
Mhm.
after interviewing a government official, that only 6 or 7 million of those are folks with private sector jobs, not governmental
Mm.
jobs, and the total about 11 million have jobs, and the rest are government employees. And so I
Mhm.
thought, as I read your book, use the term bribery, and basically
Mhm.
the government gets bloated. How
Mm.
does that sort of work, and is that an accurate example of where we're headed, maybe? Or
Yeah, yeah. So that sort of thing happens in a lot of hyperinflating economies. And I've been to Argentina, I've been to Lebanon, I've been to Turkey, I've been to Egypt. And the general thing that happens is that, especially in a democracy, it's very important to make sure that you have a solid base of support. And that base of support tends to be in these countries, the public sector employees, because, well, you're paying them and you're
sure.
not threatening to cut them and so on. So for governments to stay in power, they need to make sure that the public sector employees are satisfied. So what happens is they will often, well, first of all, it's very hard to get fired from a lot of these public sector jobs because
Mhm.
they're votes, and if you fire them, they're no longer going to vote for you, and you will be no longer be in power. Um, but when you're paying them and you keep deficit spending like most of these countries do, then the prices go up. But if the prices are going up, these public sector employees are also affected. So at some point, they will tell the government, "Hey, we need a raise because we can't afford the things that we need to live." So the government, knowing that these are very reliable votes and you need them to stay in power, will give them a raise. But that means that more money goes into that economy, and that means that the price of the goods will go up further. In which case, the public sector employees will be complaining again, and the government will then give them a raise, and it's a vicious cycle, and it's happened in a lot of these places. And this is actually pretty characteristic of a lot of hyperinflating economies, that the public sector employees drive a lot of the inflation because they need more money to afford the things
Mm.
to continue in whatever it is that they're doing. It's gotten so bad that in Lebanon, something like almost a third of the population, I think, is in some way affiliated with the government in
Oh
what
my gosh.
what they're supposed to do. Their salaries are so low because it's hyperinflated so much that they go out and get second jobs and don't show up to work. They're not going to get fired because it's actually relatively cheap to keep them on the payroll. But that's essentially what's happened, and that happens sort of at the late stage of hyperinflation. Now, your other question was, is this where we're headed in the United States? I would say that there's a strong possibility. If you count up not just federal employees, but state employees and local government employees, it ends up actually being something like 18 to 19% of the US working population that works in some way with the public sector.
Mm.
And if you add up, I guess, a lot of the compliance personnel and, sort of government contractors and people like that, it very quickly adds up to a significant percentage of the US workforce. And this dynamic can very well start to come into play as we experience more and more inflation, because we're already at a lot of inflation. A lot of people feel like they're getting screwed, and
Mhm.
the public employee unions and the public sector employees, um, you know, they're going to want raises, and as soon as they get a raise, that that puts a lot of pressure into prices, which will in turn force the government to give them raises, and we can very easily enter into the hyperinflationary spiral. I don't know when it's going to happen, but that seems to be where we're headed.
Hmm. I mean, that's that we could spend, the whole time talking about that, but I want to go through each, sort
Hmm.
of category here. Next is zooming into corporate
Hmm.
incentive structure. You talk about in the book, you talk about zombie companies,
Hmm.
and maybe you could tell us what that is, and then go into the difference. I thought it was interesting, kind of revelatory in my experience, the difference between traditional valuation versus
Hmm.
modern valuation, and how
Hmm.
basically the equities are just super pumped these days based on the system. Could you talk a little bit about that stuff?
Yeah. So the traditional way to value equities, bonds, or any financial investment vehicle is to figure out what kind of returns you're able to get. So for a bond, that's fairly easy. You get paid a certain amount for owning the bond on a yearly basis, and that's called a coupon, and you get paid that. The equity equivalent is dividends. So you're supposed to receive some amount of money on a regular basis. Unfortunately,
Where does
we've
that
gone
money come
so
from? If you
for,
don't mind.
those come from profits. So
Okay.
dividends and bonds come from whatever. So if you own a corporate bond, for example, the company borrows money from you essentially, and they're supposed to pay you a share of their profits as a bond coupon. Um, Now with a stock, it's a little bit different because they pay a percentage of their profits to you. So oftentimes you get some fixed. I mean, so I guess you can have a stock with a fixed dividend, but oftentimes it's based on how they performed and so on. It
Okay.
used to be that equity valuation was very closely related to the dividend, and under a sound money economy, this was the only way it really worked. And if you look back at the stock market from the 19th century, that's how it was. Dividends were upwards of 8, 10, 12%, and so on. Like that, it was like a real return for
Hmm.
owning the stock. You got 12% of the value of the stock. Now, that seems absolutely crazy today because
Yeah.
no stock does that. I think at most you have like 3% dividends, and these are like close to bankrupt companies or something like that. Um, the reason why that's happened is because of all of the money that's come into the economy through money printing. So when people get money, they want to keep it. They want to outrace the 7% inflation and keep the value of the money that they have. So a lot of money has gone into the two places where it stores value pretty well. One is real estate, and the other is stocks. And what we're talking about right now is stocks. So, if you could get 8%, that would be amazing because that would by
Mhm.
itself keep up with the 7% inflation. But that there's so much money going into that gets bidded down, and the price appreciation essentially kind of makes up for it. At a certain point, the companies realize, like, I don't need to send out a dividend. People will buy it regardless because they want a
Hype.
safe place to hold their money. And we've gotten to a point where we have a company like Amazon, which in its almost 20 well, it's been more than 20 years. It's almost 30 years of existence, has never paid a dividend in a single,
Wow.
like, and is one of the largest market cap companies in the world. So,
Mhm.
from a traditional equity valuation standpoint, it doesn't make any sense to own Amazon stock because they're not paying dividends and they never will, or they don't have any plans to ever do that. And if you keep holding it and they never pay dividends, then you're really only relying on price appreciation, which is the entire stock market right now. And
Mhm.
it's become much more of what you would call a Keynesian beauty contest. It's based on what people find popular, and not based on the actual equity or actual cash flow profits or anything like that. It's based on retail mind share. It's based on how much people want the stock, regardless of valuation and so on. So you get weird situations like Wall Street bets, where they pump the stock of GameStop
Yeah.
because I mean it wasn't paying any dividends anyway. They just wanted to pump it because they had a lot of nostalgia around it. And so essentially Fiat broke the stock market.
Yeah, that's so. And I told you I work in the medical space. I work
Mm,
with physicians and surgeons, and
mm,
it's amazing how nobody really understands where we've come or what sort of system we're in. Because I've
mm,
had folks will tell me if I broach the Bitcoin subject, they'll say, yeah,
mm,
I just meet with my Fidelity guy, and he tells me where to put my money, and I'm like, that's why it's so interesting is
mm,
we grow up not knowing about this system and where we've come from. To sum up, I thought this was really interesting. Just a quote from your
mhm,
book about the corporate incentive structure. You say every company is competing not to make goods or good products or services, but to be a decent store of value. And I think it's so
mm,
evident. And I doubt like learning about the financial system
mm,
because of Bitcoin, it's so evident that that's the case. Let's move on because we're running out of time. I know the individual incentive structure. You say in the book that quote fiat trends towards nihilism. Could
mm.
you elaborate on that a little bit and where?
Yeah, so essentially the dynamic that we see in the stock market, where popularity is way more important than anything else, because no one's paying dividends at this point, or very few stocks do. Um, then popularity is actually kind of a political game, right? And it's not really about the fundamentals at all. And at that point, sort of a nihilistic mentality takes hold, where popularity at all costs, where you can essentially suspend reality, comes into play. And we're seeing that with especially in altcoins, where something like Dogecoin, which has zero purported value or innovation or anything, there's zero excuse, it's just a meme, um, can pump based on it just being popular, period, with no other reason. And a lot of Wall Street was kind of like that with the Wall Street bets crowd. They pumped Hertz after they declared bankruptcy. Now, that should be like very strange, because a bankrupt stock is worth zero,
Mhm.
but it went up based on their pumping of it. And this sort of thing has happened in the past. If you saw the GM bankruptcy, and they actually after they declared bankruptcy, the stock actually went up that day, because there were so many people sort of playing it. This was before Bitcoin. This was 2008.
Mhm.
And that sort of thing has been around for a while because of this Keynesian beauty contest, like sort of will to power kind of nihilistic mentality. And it's unfortunate, but this is what fiat money enables, because you can suspend reality, and you can sort of play these weird games when people are using it as a store of value when it was never meant to be one.
We'll get to Bitcoin in a minute. I want to plug your book one more time. Fiat Ruins Everything. I think for me personally, you say in the book that Bitcoin, you say come for the return, stay for the life change. And that was me, and basically I took a route through altcoins myself and
Mhm,
um, learned it, why Bitcoin's different and did my homework on, the technical aspect, which you are yourself very technical. But that wasn't really how I identified at first. I had to get there, through
mhm,
studying and that kind of stuff. But I thought it was a great book. I think it speaks to the type of people in the Bitcoin space that you're willing to spend time, writing the book and sharing it with us, because Bitcoin, Bitcoiners in themselves are altruistic. We seek truth, and that's such a contradiction of the system we're in, and the the incentive structures behind what fiat brings. So I'll let you just give us a clip of Bitcoin, why it's different, and sort of whatever you want to say about it, because I know there's other resources to go deeper. You have ones yourself, but maybe just a little bit about Bitcoin, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, well, let me make the case against fiat money first, because
Okay.
really, until you understand the problem of fiat money, it's very hard to understand what Bitcoin is for. So, you come from sort of the medical field, and you have all these doctors that are telling you, "Oh, I just don't think about it." Here's what I would tell them, because I used to work for a healthcare software startup way back when.
Mhm.
And what's obvious to any doctor is that they are working harder than ever. A doctor from 30 years ago, they didn't see nearly the number of patients that a current doctor sees
Sure.
now. And a lot of them are double booking the same slot, seeing one patient for 7 minutes, doing some research, seeing the other patient for 7 minutes,
Mhm.
coming back. And a lot of people know this. You go to the doctor, they're out of the room they're in the room for maybe 5 minutes of your 30-minute appointment, and the rest of it is either filled by the nurse practitioner, or even
Yeah.
an assistant or something like that. um, it wasn't always like that. Doctors used to be known for playing golf all the time, because they didn't need to see that many patients to make a decent living.
Mm.
Nowadays they have to see like 40, 50 people and so on.
That's the
And
truth.
this is just to make the same amount of money, relatively speaking, which tells you something. Everyone is getting poorer. Everything is getting worse. All the people that are doing real work, they are getting screwed. And the reason for that, I would submit to you, is fiat money. The 7% expansion has to be paid by somebody. And it's mostly paid by people doing real work, being forced to work harder for less money, or in the case of a doctor, being forced to put in more time. Most families have to have both parents working just to make ends meet. You can't afford a decent sized house, so most people don't have a very large family anymore. All of these are symptoms of the real problem, and it's fiat money. Now, once you understand that fiat money is like this because of the inflation, because of the monetary expansion, because
Mhm.
of the rise of the bureaucratic state, which is essentially what all of the money printing is paying for, then you understand the value of sound money, which is not expandable by a central controller, which does not fund bureaucrats and middlemen and rent seekers. Instead, value goes to the people that provide it. And that's where we should be. Unfortunately, there's such a large rent-seeking class in any fiat economy that they suck a lot of the value from the people that are providing it. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, that's suckers like you or me, the people that are actually going and doing the work. Bitcoin is that alternate system, and it's sound money. It's decentralized. There's no central controller. You can keep the money. There's no monetary expansion, so the value that you get to save, you keep, and the efficiencies of what the productivity gains and so on all accrue back to you instead of the bureaucratic state. And that would be why I would tell you to go and look at Bitcoin seriously. Not going to convince you in a 5 minute speech. That's not what this thing is. It's not like some political issue. I'm not trying to win you over to my side or anything like that. It's something that you have to investigate for yourself. But hopefully, I've given you enough motivation to go learn something about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's the point of these short clips
Mm.
of folks like you that have done the work, and kind of concisely explain things. Thanks so much for your time, Jimmy. Here's the book again. Go get it, and I appreciate it.
Thanks.